All right, shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rechakwadash. Double honors to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of Great Millstone, who rule very well, very beautifully. Double salutations unto the Akim out here pushing this gospel in truth and in sincerity to the best of their ability, given to them by Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai. Peace, blessings, and salutations be unto the elect scattered abroad. May the election of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shiloh, will live upon your houses. This is the brother Kwana Watt. Come back at you, Lord will, with edifying lesson through the spirit and power of Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shiloh will. It is edifying, Lord will. It is straight to the point. I came across this article as well as another article, as I was watching, man, and whatnot. And, when I came across these articles and I was reading them, and hey, man, America is falling, right? And fast, right? As you see right here, it's on the peoplesvoice.tv. It says EU reject Trump's Ukraine peace deal, right? The EU ultimately stands for European Union, right? These are all the different nations, right, over there in Europe, which are ultimately allied, right, with America, man. But again, as we've seen, right, the last few years, right, that relationship between America and these European nations is, starting to get rocky, right? Just by the different decisions that, America and these different administrations, right, going from Trump's first administration to Biden administration to now back to Trump administration, there's been a lot of rocky different, decisions that these European countries, have ultimately been affected, right? When it, going to, I think it was Trump, if I'm not mistaken, Trump, his administration, they ultimately sanctioned, no, it's like it was Biden administration, they sanctioned Russia. And Trump, I think it was France and Germany and just a couple other, European nations were like, hey, don't put sanctions on Russia because 40% of their economy runs off of Russian oil, and America went ahead and put sanctions on Russia, right? Heavily affected them, and that was just one of many different decisions, right? Even leading up to now, right? Recently where, America was basically, that whole bullshit with, Trump basically cussing out Zelensky, at the White House, and then, saying that they're not going to back or protect, Ukraine. Hey, well, the EU jumped in, right, being fed up with America and their decisions, right, jumped in and say, you know what, we're going to go ahead and create our own deal with Ukraine, right, our own, NATO-like partnership, right, with Ukraine, right, they're going to ultimately protect Ukraine from Russia, when America ultimately was threatening, not to, so they went ahead and are starting to make decisions, right, on their own without America. And this is what we're seeing again right here, right? It says EU reject Trump's Ukraine peace deal, right? So Trump ultimately offered up a peace deal. The EU is saying, nah, we ain't having that, right? This is ultimately between, Ukraine and Russia, right? Which it should be just those three, right, in talks, right? Because America is supplying Ukraine, right? It really should be between Vladimir Zelensky and Vladimir Putin of Russia, right? Making some type of peace deal. But see, America is the one that's aiding Ukraine in this fight, right? So this is why you see Trump ultimately issuing a peace deal, But here comes the EU saying, no, we ain't going to have that, man. It says the EU has rejected the Ukraine peace deal drafted by the White House and put forward its own set of conditions for a potential agreement. Right, it says, according to reports, Brussels has expressed outright opposition to key points of the U.S. plan. In a series of statements, EU leaders rejected possible territorial resolutions to the Ukraine conflict allegedly included in the U.S. drafted peace plan submitted last week. The European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, or Leyen, or however you say that, made an announcement on Sunday as U.S. officials were discussing Washington's proposal with EU and Ukrainian representative in Geneva, Switzerland. In a statement published on X, von der Leyen specifically rejected all those conditions. We have agreed on the main elements necessary for a just and lasting peace and Ukraine's sovereignty, she stated, adding that Ukraine's border cannot be changed by force, and that no limitations can be placed on Kyiv's military. So they're, again, right, they're ultimately saying, hey, you're not able to, ultimately state, right, where the border lies and where it doesn't. It says this puts her in direct conflict with the leaked peace plan developed and submitted by Washington last week. Right? It says on Saturday, Bloomberg reported the EU was seeking to essentially rewrite the U.S. plan by disguising major changes to it as constructive updates. The bloc was also reported trying to buy Ukraine more time and postpone the American deadline set by U.S. President Donald Trump for Thursday. So, and there you have it. And that was ultimately the end of that, of this article, right? But again, just showing you that America's allies are no longer siding with America and the certain decisions that America, ultimately makes, And I have another article, again, just backing this up as well, right? This is, again, on the People's Voice. It says, we don't need the U.S. anymore, right? Prime Minister Carney uses G20 stage to urge planetary unity in emerging world government, right? And now, this right here in the picture, you see Macron, right, which is the French prime minister, I think president, if I'm not mistaken, on the left hand side, and then Carney is on the right hand side, with the gray hair, right? It says Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said, use the G20 stage in Johannesburg to call for a new world order defined by a global government that excludes the United States and counterbalances American influence in the world. So they're done with America, man. Right? They're absolutely done with America. They're done with the fact that, America is, saying and doing shit that ultimately doesn't, benefit them in any way. You had it to where, Trump has sanctioned, Canada, and Canada's right there, right? Literally connected to, connected to America, right? So you figure, right, they would ultimately, have some type of leniency, right, on their, their neighbors, man, right? But no, right? Trump is ultimately saying, fuck it, I'm sanctioning everybody, right? Or we're raising tariffs on everybody, including their allies, man, which has heavily affected their allies, It says with Washington boycotting the summit, Carney argued that the rest of the world can exclude the U.S. and make progress together towards a liberal dream of a unified global government. For many, this was more than diplomatic commentary. It was a glimpse into what globalists are trying to promote as the post-American governance era, So again, everybody is, just fed up with, America and, again, the decisions that America is making, This is heavy, man. This is beautiful, right? Call law Yahweh Shemel Shah, because, again, we're looking at the end, right, of that American regime, that American rule, right? That wicked rulership that America has ultimately been pushing, right, for so long, And I'm not going to, get into, more of this, man. I just wanted to grab the major points, right? The point being that America's allies are ultimately turning against it, So let's jump right here and do Isaiah, the 47th chapter. And we start at verse 1. It says, come down and sit in the dust, O virgin daughter of Babylon, which when you go into Google, right, you can ultimately look up who is the virgin daughter of Babylon today. And it will pull up America, man. The Elder Apostle Gabar has, ultimately done a lesson on this. They it's proven, right? These average scholars, these pagan Christian scholars, right? They know that America is Babylon the Great. It says, sit on the ground, there is no throne, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called tender and delicate, man. These nations are not looking at, America as some kind of, we have to have, America is this cash cow, we can send our products to there and we can get money and, we're going to heavily benefit, from, doing business with America. No, these nations are saying, hey, because when you read in that article, Hey, Canada is saying we're going to branch out, right? We're going to start, trading and doing deals outside of America. That we don't need America anymore. We're going to start trading and doing deals elsewhere. You've seen a video, or I seen a video, Salakia, right? I seen a video, I want to say a few weeks back, right? Maybe 2-3 weeks back, of a so-called, Chinese woman, right? A Moabite woman, right? And holding up, a stake and showing, right, the area where all the stakes are at, right? They don't, as America was, putting tariffs on China, China, a woman was saying, hey, China's not really affected. They're just going to buy their beef from somewhere else, and that their beef, that they're buying somewhere else is really honestly even better, right? So it's just a better choice overall, right? So America's really losing out, on putting tariffs on all these different nations, man, right? Yes, to a certain degree, right? Putting tariffs, on, other nations for that country that is putting the tariffs on, right? It can be good for them, right? Because it raises the prices of their competitors and ultimately, makes it to where the people that are within that nation that is putting those tariffs, so like Trump's putting the tariffs on, right? The American citizen is going to look at all these foreign products and say, hey, the price is skyrocketing. Let's go and buy at home or homegrown products, which are going to help stimulate the economy and more, right? But see, again, these nations are sitting there saying, nah, we don't need you, right? And then even then, right, Trump is making it to where he's buying product outside of, and funding product outside of his, their own people, right? He's buying Argentinian beef, taking the money away and the soybeans away from, American, farmers, right? So even making not only the foreign product expensive, but even the homegrown product is expensive, man. Destroying the people, right? Which is fucking, bullshit, man. So it really all around, right? From within and from without, right? America is losing in all directions, right? It says, verse 2, it says, take the millstones and grind meal, uncover thy locks, make bare the leg, uncover the thigh, pass over the rivers. Thy nakedness shall be uncovered, and it says, yea, thy shame shall be seen. And guess what? All this information is coming out, especially about the Epstein files and, America basically helping, Ukraine to set up some type of, these A-chroming sites, right? Over there in Ukraine, right? Stealing kids, this, that, and the third, right? You had Russia, I want to say maybe a year ago, right? Was ultimately trying to uncover that, right? A Russian general ultimately came out and stated that this is what they were doing over there in Ukraine. So it's like, all this information has been coming out. All this shit has been coming out, pointing out that the American Edomite is the worst of the worst, and it says, what I will take vengeance and will not meet thee as a man. Right. Right, because the Lord Yahweh Shem Shai is starting to turn, America's allies against him, which is the Lord ultimately recompensing, right? Starting to recompense America for that wickedness, man, that it's been pushing in the earth for so fucking long, so like, let me open this door, getting warm, but it says what? And I will not meet thee as a man, because when Yahweh Shai comes, right, to ultimately put the cherry on top to the destruction of this place, hey, Yahweh Shai gonna do it in the angelical, body, right? Coming with that, that spiritual power, right? Keep going. It says, as for our Redeemer, the Yahweh, it says, the Lord of hosts is his name, right? Yahweh, Bahashim Yahshua, the Holy One of Israel. Sit thou silent and get thee into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for thou shalt no more be called the Lady of Kingdoms, right? America is no more on top, right? As we read in Jeremiah, the 50th chapter, let's go ahead and jump to that. It's like in Jeremiah 51 and verse 7, it says, Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, right? Because again, for so long, America's been on top. America has, been this nation in which all the other nations, want to, be in bed with, right? Want to do a deal and trade and so on and so forth with. But see, again, all that's coming to an end, right? It says that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken over wine, therefore the nations are mad, right? These nations have gotten in bed with America. ultimately, you know, drank of that juice, became bugged out, right? Allowing for Moism, allowing for, you know, all these different, you know, abominable shit to, you know, basically penetrate their nation, penetrate their people. And now they're starting to see it. Now they want nothing to do with America, right? Now they want nothing to do, you know, with Babylon, right? Right, verse 6, it says, I was wroth with my people. I have polluted mine inheritance and given them into thine hand. Right? It's ultimately talking about the Israelites. Right? You know, we went off, right? The Lord ultimately, you know, punished us, and that punishment was what? Us. You know, after many times, right? We going off, right? The Lord put us in captivity after captivity after captivity, and this is the worst one, right? This is the worst punishment, man. You know, and the scriptures say that, you know, that he forwarded the affliction. I mean, he did more than he was supposed to do. He was made to be a whooping stick, right, for us, man, to punish us. But see, Esau did all manner of evil and wickedness unto us, and he has to pay for that, right? He's not going to get away, right, with that shit, right? The scriptures say, you know, that, you know, let the iniquity of his father and his mother, right, be remembered before the Lord continually. You know, that Psalms 109. Right, also says that the Lord will not acquit the wicked, right? For 3 transgressions and for 4, the Lord will not turn away the, you know, the punishment of Esau, Edom, right? That's Amos, the 1st chapter, around the 11th verse. You know, Salakia, right? Right, so Esau's gonna have to pay for that, right? It says, I was wroth with my people. I have polluted mine inheritance and given them into thine hand. Thou didst show them no mercy. It said, thou didst show them no mercy. Upon the ancients hast thou very heavily laid the yoke, right? And as it says in, James 2:13, right? That he shall have judgment without mercy to him that have shown no mercy, right? And see, this is why we're seeing, right, America's allies, right, even those who are literally connected to them, right, Canada, right, turn it against America, man. Right? It says, verse 7, it says, and thou saidest, I shall be a lady forever, so that thou didst not lay these things to thine heart, neither didst remember the latter end, right? So you're ultimately, again, moving how you were moving, but you didn't consider, you know, the consequences of your actions. Right? America's just moving how it's moving and not thinking that, you know, there's going to be any kind of consequence, right? This is why you have, you know, Trump and his administration acting the way he's doing, even towards his allies, as the scriptures say, right? That he, you know, should be, his look shall be more stout than his fellow, right? He coming up against, you know what, and I'm roughly paraphrasing, right? He's coming up against his own allies, man, right? Puffing at him and, you know what I mean, talking crazy to him like he did Vladimir Zelensky, man, you know? And again, these nations are fed up with that shit. That's why they're moving without America, without America's consent, man. Saying that we don't need you, you know. It says, therefore hear now this, thou that art given to pleasures, that dwellest carelessly, that sayest in thy heart, I am, and none else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, neither shall I know the loss of children. But these 2 things shall come to thee in a moment, in one day. The loss of children and widowhood, they shall come upon thee in their perfection for the multitude of their sorceries and for the great abundance of thine enchantments, right, man? You know, because you got America, you know, is ultimately ran by, you know, witches and warlocks, man. You know, all these different, you know, higher ups, man, and whatnot, right? They all, you know, they ultimately take orders from the elites, right? Who ultimately, you know, have their left-hand priesthood, right, going back to the Vatican, the Pope, so on and so forth, right? And they deal, again, on the left-hand side, right? And they speak to these demons, man. You know, and this is how they ultimately are able to accomplish the things that they're able to accomplish, man. So, like it, you know, it's through the left-hand side, right? But that's starting to ultimately fail them, man. You know, that council, right, is starting to fail them drastically, man. You know, it says, therefore shall evil come upon thee. Thou shalt not know from whence it riseth, and mischief shall fall upon thee. Thou shalt not be able to put it off, and desolation shall come upon thee suddenly, which thou shalt not know, right? And that desolation is going to come via those ICBM nuclear missiles, man. you know. And again, right, according to prophecy, right, those who are ultimately going to shoot, or some of those who are going to shoot those missiles on America, are going to be America's allies, right? There's Revelations 17 and verse 16. It says, "In the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast," which goes back to the EU, right? "These shall hate the whore," right? So they're going to end up, again, right? We're seeing the beginning stages of it, right? That these nations are saying, you know what, fuck America, you know? And not in those words, but basically, you know, the way that they're moving, the way that they're talking, right? They're shooting down a peace deal, saying, nah, you ain't gonna establish this peace, right? We're gonna revise, we're gonna edit it, and we're gonna send it out. You know, not you. You know? Whereas America, you know, fucking 15 years ago, these nations wouldn't have dared done that. You know? But the last couple years, the last few years, 3 to 4 years, hey, they've been really, you know, coming at, you know, America hard. You know? It says, "These shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire." You know? And again, that's going back to those ICBM nuclear missiles being utilized. Joel, the 2nd chapter, 2 Peter's the 3rd chapter, starting at verse 10 on down. You know? Jeremiah 50, starting at verse 9, right? That assembly of great assembly of nations, right? Coming from the north country being Russia, because they're the main ones. And then the rest of the assembly is going into Russia's allies, China's allies, you know, and then even again, as we're reading, right, America's allies, you know. So let's go back. Right, America's done, man. America's over, right? America doesn't have any power anymore. Right? Especially not over these nations, right? But Isaiah 47 verse 12, it says, "Stand now with thine enchantments, and with the multitude of thy sorceries, wherein thou hast labored from thy youth. If so be, thou shalt be able to profit. If so be, thou mayest prevail." So, hey, basically saying, hey, go seek to your, you know, your prognosticators and, you know, your astrologers and whatnot, and see if they ultimately can, you know, find a way for you. You know, because it's the way that you're going now is not working, right? The way that America's moving now is not working. These nations, America's, you know, wickedness and evil, really Esau as a whole, right? His wickedness, but mainly here, you know, the American Edomite, right? His wickedness is being revealed at an all-time high, you know, and he can't stop it, right? He can't stop, right, all this information from coming out about him, you know, and you know, and then the wickedness that's happening within America, you know. Verse 13, "Thou art wearied in the multitude of thy counsels. Let now the astrologers, the stargazers, the monthly prognosticators stand up and save thee from these things that shall come upon thee." You know, which they're not going to be able to, right? Yahweh Ba'Hashem Yahushua has ordained this place to be destroyed, right? Scriptures talk about, you know, who hath resisted the will of the Most High. You know, was that Romans 9 and 19? Who hath resisted the will of the Most High? And that's no one, right? The Lord is in control of everything that's going on. So the fact that these heathens, or it's like the fact that these allies that, you know, are starting to come up against, you know, America's allies are starting to come up against America. Hey, that's all done by the Lord, right? Proverbs 21 and 1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, and he turneth it whithersoever he will, roughly paraphrasing, you know, as well as, you know, what is that, Joel, the 3rd chapter, you know, what is that, verse 11, "Cause thy mighty ones to come down." Those are the angels that are coming down and stirring up the minds of these rulers of these different nations, man, you know. Hey, the Lord is in control. Numbers 23:19, right? The Lord is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of man that he should repent. So when he speaks a word, and you best believe it's going to happen. And we're reading right here, right, this whole chapter, when you go into the NLT, at the top it says prediction of Babylon's fall, you know. You know, this is heavy, and we're in this is exactly what is taking place and what is going to take place, right to Babylon, to America. Right? It says, verse 14, it says, "Behold, they shall be as stubble. The fire shall burn them. They shall not deliver themselves from the power of the flame. There shall not be a coal to warm at, nor fire to sit before it. Thus shall they be unto thee with whom thou hast labored, even thy merchants from thy youth. They shall wander every one to his quarter, none shall save thee. So your allies ain't gonna help you, man. You know, I'm gonna read that in the NLT too, because it's heavy, right? You read verse 15. It says, all your friends, those with whom you've done business since childhood, will go their own ways, turning a deaf ear to your cries, man. Meaning they ain't listening to you, they ain't dealing with you. You know, when you in some shit, man, America, they ain't gonna come to your aid, man. You know, at all. If anything, they're gonna side with the one that's coming up against you. You know, we read that in Obadiah. I think it's verse 7, right? It says, all your allies will turn against you, right? They will help to chase you from your land. They will promise you peace while plotting to deceive and destroy you. Your trusted friends will set traps for you and you won't even know about it, man. And this is ultimately, you know, what is going to take place and what is taking place, man, right? It hasn't necessarily came out, but maybe these, you know, EU nations, right, those who are at the G20 summit, right, are ultimately, you know, talking to, you know, Russia and some of Russia's allies. I mean, we don't necessarily know, man, you know, but ultimately it's according to prophecy that, you know, they would get together, you know, and have a common goal, which would be America, you know. So right now, again, we're looking at the downfall of America and the turning, right, of America's allies, man, you know, which is soon to be what? Soon to be the destruction of America, man. You know, we in these times, man. You know, we in these times, man. But that's all I got, man. I just want to point that out. Just speaking on, you know, America's allies, right? Turning on them, you know, rejecting this peace deal, which has nothing to do with them, right? Which, I mean, it could, you know, ultimately affect them. And that's probably why they're ultimately getting into it, right? Because, you know, the EU, you know, when dealing with Russia, right, a lot of their economy, you know, runs, you know, from a Russian trade, you know. So if that peace deal is not, you know, ultimately, you know, in favor of both sides rather than just one side, that can heavily affect, you know, the European nations, because Russia ultimately at one point was saying, hey, any of those that are allied or, you know, in cahoots with the, you know, with America, right, are ultimately going to be sanctioned. And that's what happened to, you know, these European countries. And that's why they were getting hurt so bad, you know. It's because America was ultimately, you know, just being one-sided, didn't want to, you know, ultimately, you know, bring forth a fair deal, you know, and it ultimately bit, you know, the European nations in the ass. Slovakia, man. You know, so again, right, now we're seeing them say, nah, fuck that. You know, you ain't gonna be setting no deal. We're gonna be monitoring this. We're gonna be, you know, ultimately getting our hands in this, man. Right? America's done, man. America has no power over these nations at all anymore. Right? America's just ultimately, you know, a fucking drama show, really, at this point. You know, that people are, you know, they're gonna continue to watch, or they're gonna fucking turn off the TV. You know. But that's all I got, man. I just wanted to speak on that through the Spirit, Lord will. It was edifying, Lord will. Straight to the point. I want to give all praise, honor, glory to Yahweh. Salaki, I want to give all praise, honor, glory to Yahweh, Bahashim, Yahweh Shai, Bahashim, Rachak, Wadash, that belongs to the elder apostles, the elder bishops, the elders of the great millstone. Till next time, I say shalom.